Shalom and welcome back to what really is the second half of our session on the chronology of Jesus with guest presenter Steve Hudson. That entire recording that we did with Steve was a little too long for it being simply one session, so I decided to split it into two, and this is where we're picking up the conversation with Steve. This is part two of that session. Incidentally, we will be also posting a final session on the chronology of Jesus and his ministry, specifically in Jerusalem during his Passion Week. So, with this, let's get started with what is the second half of the chronology of the life and ministry of Jesus.
That, he makes the move to Capernaum. And John, as we close this phase, I want to just talk about four key transitions that have happened in here. And there's a great picture of the shoreline along Capernaum, along the Sea of Galilee on the northwestern side. And John, the four transitions at the end of this year and a half to a year and 3/4. There's a transition in leadership. John the Baptist is off the scene, and Jesus now steps fully in to his role as the Messiah. There's a change in message. As you look at the Gospels right in this time frame, it says, from this time on, Jesus began to preach. Repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. That had been John's message, and now Jesus picks that message up. There was a change in location. Jesus moved from Nazareth to Capernaum. John and I always say Jesus had three hometowns. He had a birth town, that was Bethlehem. He had a growing up town, that was Nazareth. And he had a ministry headquarters town, and that was Capernaum. And so Jesus makes that move, a change in location. And then finally, there's a fourth transition. And this is the change in challenge. And this leads us to this next phase, and that's ministry training and expanded outreach. It's phase 3 and 4. You see there's a dotted line between that, not the solid line, and that's 6 to 9 months. And here's the change in challenge. Matthew 4:19, Jesus has just made the move. One day he's walking along the Sea of Galilee and he sees those brothers fishing. And he says, come follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. He's had come and see, he's had follow me, and now he has follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And this gets back to the whole issue that we see later in his life when he's going, man, the harvest is plentiful out there. And I don't need more leaders. Jesus never asks about leaders, but he's always talking about workers. And this move from ministry foundations to ministry training and expanded outreach, it's key because he's getting his disciples now into the harvest field. He's taking them fishing. And what I love about this, John, is Luke has 6 fishing trips in chronological order. Mark has most of them, but Luke just kind of boom, 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 boom. And we don't have pictures for those, but let me just quickly mention these along the way. The first thing, he's at Capernaum. He's at the synagogue. You've already showed us pictures from the air of that. And from the Capernaum synagogue, there's a demoniac in the synagogue, and Jesus casts out the demon on Sabbath. Later that afternoon, he's down at Peter's house with his mother-in-law that same afternoon, and he heals her. That night, it's street legal now because Sabbath's done. Everyone comes around because they've heard what's gone on. And he teaches and he heals and he casts out demons. And so that second fishing trip, is at Peter's mother-in-law's. The first trip, I would say, kind of synagogue fishing or church fishing. We've got people in our churches that we attend now that still don't know the Lord. and they need to. And then family fishing with his mother-in-law. And we've got people, all of us in our families, that need to come out like the disciples to say, we found the Messiah. Mark 1:35, early the next morning, while it was still dark, he's up praying at a lonely eremos, a solitary place. He's hearing from the Father. In his humanity, he always talked to the Father. I don't do anything apart from what my Father tells me to do. And the disciples looking for him, they're going, you got to come back down here. We've got a great gig going here. And he goes, nope, I've got to go elsewhere. And so he goes out, John, on a kind of a ministry tour throughout the Galilee at this point in time. And this is where, when I say that phase was 6 to 9 months, I don't know how long that ministry tour was. It could have been 3 weeks. It could have been 3 months. Josephus, the Jewish historian who wrote for the Romans, said that there were 204 villages in the Galilee. Eckhart Schnabel, who's a New Testament scholar, has taught in the US and also in some foreign countries. He's written some great books on the ministry of Jesus and his life. He says he can research and find at least 175 different villages in the Galilee that would have had a population of over 200,000 people altogether. So if Jesus is on this ministry tour, and I think the guys probably went with him. I mean, can you imagine Peter? I mean, his wife's going, yeah, go with the rabbi. I mean, he just healed my mom, and we'll take care of things back here. So Jesus is out and about, and word's starting to spread. And eventually, disciples start to filter back. Now we get the third fishing trip. Jesus comes back, and Peter's fishing, and he's caught nothing. He's skunked. Nets are empty. And Jesus is teaching at Capernaum down along the seashore, and there's crowds all around him. And Peter's repairing his nets. He's getting them ready for the next day. And eventually Jesus said, can I get in the boat? And so he gets out a little bit deeper. So he has this natural amphitheater and he can talk to the people. We don't know what his message was. We don't know how long he spoke. By the way, I would call this marketplace fishing. All the people were gathering down there in the morning, right? They'd had their bread baking and they're ready for that. And now it's the fish because they fished during the night and they were going to get fish to go with that bread. And so this is the marketplace. And Jesus is talking down there. And at the end, he says to Peter, let's go out in the deep. And Peter's going, you've got to be kidding me. You're the tecton, the carpenter from Nazareth. You don't know squat about fishing. This has been my life. He goes, but because you say so, I will. And we have that huge catch of fish where they have to bring the partners with their boats. And Peter goes down on his knees in the middle of a pile of fish. And he says, get away from me. I'm a sinful man. Marketplace fishing, but Jesus was the one that caught a big fish that day. That was Peter. I'm convinced from that time on, John, Peter made a ton of mistakes, but from that time on, Peter had said, I'm all in. I believe you, even though I struggle at times. Well, the fourth different fishing trip right after that Luke talks about was when we had the leper that comes up and says, you know, if you heal me, if you'll heal me if you can. And it says Jesus threw his arms around him, literally embraced him, which would have been totally out of context for what you did with lepers when you kind of skirted around them and they had to make their presence known. And he healed that leper. And I call that kind of unlovely and disenfranchised and kind of the people that you want to stay away from, that kind of fishing. And we've got people that are branded as lepers in every one of our communities. I don't mean real lepers, but that we want to stay away from. They're unkempt, they're unlovely, and Jesus is helping his disciples see, if you're going to fish with me, we're going to go into those places. Fifth fishing trip that came right after that. Remember that story about the 4 friends that let the paralytic down into the house back in Capernaum? So now we're back at Capernaum again. And at that point in time, they ripped that roof apart. I always say that they were youth workers because they didn't care about what damage they were doing. They were just out there to get the job done. And remember, religious leaders from Jerusalem and Judea and the whole area. They were up there because word had been going around. They're sitting in this house. They're looking up and seeing the dirt and the twigs and the plaster start to come down on their head. And they're going, what in the world is this? And Jesus looks at the men's faith and the guy's faith, and he says, because of that, your sins are forgiven. And the religious leaders went nuts.
Mm.
And they go, I mean, how can you do this? And Jesus said, what's easier, to say your sins are forgiven, which you can't prove, you can't see, or to say you're healed? So take up your mat and walk, just so you know that I can do that. It's interesting. The end of that little story says the people saw, and the Greek word is paradoxa. It's a paradox. They saw things they didn't expect to see that day. It was remarkable things. And I call this this kind of fishing the antagonistic. And we're going to run into people like that where we live, work, study, and play, John, that don't want to believe, that are going to push back on everything. And that doesn't mean we can ignore them or skirt around them. We continue to reach out in love that way. And that 6 fishing trip, that's when he went to Matthew's house. And I picture Matthew. He's watching all this going on over the 6 to 9 month time frame. And he's seeing all these different people following Jesus. And I keep thinking, did he sit there in that little tax collector's booth going, man, I wish I could be part of that? Man, would he ever take me? Because all these other Jewish people hate me because I'm a collaborator. Would he ever accept me? And I think when Jesus said, yeah, Matthew got so excited. What did he do? He called all his friends together and they had a big party, of which the Pharisees got frustrated with and again castigated Jesus about. And so I call that, the sinners fishing, or those that are far from God, or those that are not even interested. So when Jesus said at the start of this phase 3 or 4, 6 to 9 months, follow me and I'm going to make you fishers of men, then he gets them fishing, John. 6 different instances, all different kinds of settings where there would have been different lessons for them to learn. Well, at the end of this phase, he goes down to Jerusalem, and this is for the Feast of the Jews, either probably a Passover or in the fall, Tabernacles. And when he goes down to Jerusalem, this is where he's at the pool of Bethesda. John, this has been an archaeological kind of conundrum for a long time. Do you want to talk a little bit about your pictures here?
Well, let's just go back to this model that's represented on the 1 to 50 scale Jerusalem model at the Israel Museum. And it was found actually just to the north of the Temple Mount today. It was just that close, and yet through really a lot of archaeology, a lot of what you see above where I'm pointing to is all from much later time periods, Byzantine, even through Crusader, but they have found the original steps of this pool,
Yeah.
and there they are. So when we visit this place, we at least go where we get a good view of what happened here. And Steve, you just illustrated so well the redemptive purpose of Jesus through all of his fishing trips. Well, this guy, lame for what was it, 38 years, I believe.
8 years. Yep.
And what a remarkable question Jesus asked him. Do you want to get well? Like, what kind
Mm.
of question is that to someone who's been here probably almost his whole lifetime? He probably grew content with playing the role of a beggar or a needy person, and yet Jesus asked him uh, if he wanted to get well. Now, is that a question about his physical nature, or was Jesus aiming for the heart in this situation? What do you think?
You know what? I think it was both. I think it's kind of like the paralytic. Because of
Yeah,
your faith, your sins are forgiven. And just so you know, get up and walk. And he said to this guy the same thing, get up
yeah,
and walk. And a little later in the story, John, remember right after this, this guy goes into the temple. Now, you and I both know from where that pool of Bethesda is to where the north side of the Temple Mount is, 100 yards max.
right.
really a short distance. So he would have gone in there, and then he explained, they got mad at him because he was carrying his mat on the
The
Sabbath, and
Shabbat,
he
right?
explained what was going on, and then they're going to start gunning for Jesus. And then Jesus says a little while later to him, "Stop sinning or something worse will happen to you." So I think it wasn't just the physical side of stuff here. Sometimes we can get comfortable in our maladies, whether they're physical or emotional or spiritual, and we don't want to make those changes.
So
Well,
where does Jesus go from here?
from here, Jesus heads back up north, and we have three little stories, that show these Sabbath controversies. That pool of Bethesda. Then there's a little story about disciples picking grain, going through the edge of the grain fields on Sabbath, and
Hmm.
the religious leaders hated that. And then he gets back up to Galilee, and there's a man with a shriveled hand, and Jesus does that whole story with them. And at the end of this phase, we start to see that large crowds are following him. So now let's go to that last phase, and we'll wrap it up. This is phase 5. You can see it on the right-hand side of that chart there. And this is leadership multiplication. Now, John, we're 2.5 years probably in at this point in Jesus' public ministry. And this is when he chooses the 12. And so he spends a night in prayer. Now, Jesus gets away 40 some times in the Gospels to pray when you count them all up. But this is the only time it says he spends the entire night praying. Why? Because he knows he's going to be appointing leaders to continue the movement when he returns to his heavenly Father, when he takes his place at the right hand of the Father. And so after that night in prayer, it says he called all of his disciples to him, and from them he chose the 12. So I don't want people to get the idea that he had a limited fishing pool. He had to kind of, he had just had to take Judas. That was the last guy standing. He had a pool of disciples that had been following him. We read earlier, or we'll talk about it, in fact, that he had women disciples following. And so he chooses the 12, and we have the Sermon on the Mount. And I really think that's his ordination message to this 12, because he comes back down, he chooses the 12, and then he preaches this sermon, and it says that there's a lot of other people listening, probably not only his followers, but other people, because they'd been hearing everything that had been going on, and they were seeing and hearing about those 6 fishing trips. So this is a beautiful setting, isn't it, John? This sermon on the Mount of Beatitudes.
Yeah, it's a traditional location. The idea is that this was a natural amphitheater from this, again, chapel built in the late 1930s by the same architect, incidentally, as who built the Chapel of the Shepherds in Bethlehem, but in Beit Sahur. But this is the idea. And I know a team of Swedish audiologists, Steve, did a testing here, and certainly, if the wind is right, they determined if someone was standing down there, down below, 5,000 plus people could have heard someone speak. And whether this is the setting of the Sermon on the Mount, or whether, as I would contend, maybe it was the lower slopes of the Arbel near Magdala. Again, we don't know, but location here in this case is not what's most important. It's the message of the kingship of Christ, and what it meant to be a kingdom citizen and follower of Jesus. So maybe it happened here, maybe it didn't, but the message was heard loud and clear.
Now, John, this phase 5 that we're talking about, leadership multiplication, if you look at all the Gospels and would hold them all up and kind of stick paper clips in the content of each of those phases, by far, most is written in the Gospels on these last 15 months of Jesus.
Hmm.
And I always talk about the fact that there's 3 C's that really, in my mind, you see starting to come forth in here. One of the C's is crowds. The crowds now start to build, and we'll talk about that in a minute. They've been starting to build because of those fishing trips, and now they start to explode. Conflict. Now we're starting to see the religious leaders definitely going after Jesus and feeling threatened by him. And the third C is cost. He hasn't talked a lot prior to these last 15 months about the cost of following, because in the early stages, when you're with people, it's a come and see and it's a follow me, and then let's get out in the harvest field and fish a little bit. But now he starts to lay out in these last 15 months the cost. Well, he heals the centurion's servant in Capernaum. Then he's over to Nain, and you've got that on the map there. And Nain is where he raises the widow's son. Interestingly, it's right by Shunem, and that's in the Old Testament, where another widow's son was raised by Elisha at that point in time. Do you get to Nain very often? Tell us a little
No,
bit about.
I just visited there with a filming crew, and this is it. There's no archaeology that I am aware of, and
Yep.
yet being on the northern slopes of the Hill of Moray, and as you mentioned, Shunem being on the other side, two resurrections took place here with about 700 years plus apart from each other.
Yeah. Well, he heads back over towards his home area. And when he gets back over towards Capernaum, this is where he talks in terms of these three cities, Chorazin, Bethsaida, and Capernaum. And he basically brings the woes, the curses on them. He says, you've seen most of the miracles in your three cities, and yet you still don't believe. And different people will call this the Orthodox triangle because of the Orthodox faith of those people, the evangelical triangle because the evangelium, the gospel that was spoken about here, but three different cities. And there's nothing written about Chorazin in terms of any miracles in the gospels.
Hmm.
There's a couple of miracles listed at Bethsaida, and there's a lot at Capernaum. But then I go to what John said at the end of his gospel: if all of the things would have been written about everything that Jesus said, there wouldn't be enough books to contain them.
Yeah, the ruins here at Korzim are primarily third century, although during the COVID season, if you will, underneath the third century synagogue, they did find a first century level. So that would not be surprising to me, but this city located on the northwest corner, high above Capernaum and Bethsaida on the north, was one of these three condemned by Jesus for their unbelief.
And he did that a little later in his ministry too, and referenced those same three cities. Maybe they ended up being like today when we go, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? So you kind of know Bethsaida, Chorazin, Capernaum, woe to you. And people maybe heard that message.
Here is an aerial drone of Tel Araj, it's called, a new suggested site for Bethsaida. I know some of the ruins are primarily Byzantine, 5th and 6th century, but first century mosaics and even perhaps a first century wall. And some are suggesting already that that may have been Peter's house. After all, Peter, Andrew, and Philip grew up here, according to John 1. But we return to Capernaum, Steve, and again, you illustrated all the miracles, the many miracles that really that took place here. We could read Mark 1, Mark 2, really Mark 9, Luke 7, John 6. These passages that highlight the activity of Jesus, whether he's teaching, whether he's performing a miracle. And again, this is a late 4th, early 5th century synagogue built over most likely the first century one. So Jesus spent a lot of time here.
Well, John, I know we've taken a lot of time and I want to get through this phase 5. And again, like I said, most of the things in the Gospels happened in this leadership multiplication.
Mhm.
Jesus' feet were anointed by that sinful and contrite woman at this point in time. He takes a tour with the 12 and a bunch of women. And one of those women is Mary Magdalene, another Susanna. It says other women. And I find an interesting name, Joanna, who is the wife of Cusa, And Cusa is the estate manager of Herod Antipas, who is ruling this whole region. So the political ruler, one of his top officials, is funding the ministry of Jesus during this time frame.
Wow.
I find it very humorous, and it also shows the fact I never want people to think this is all about the men who he called. Women had such a key role and a growing role. It was so different for Jesus. And then his first public rejection by the Jewish leaders, and they said he was in league with Beelzebub. And then the parables, they all happen, and Matthew 13 records a whole bunch of them. It's interesting, John, they don't happen till phase 5. Why? Because this is leadership mollification. He's equipping his leaders. And after he tells the parables near the end of chapter 13 of Matthew, they're in a house and the guys say, well, tell us, explain what this means. And so he's giving them instruction and helping equip them that way. At the end of that day, he hops in a boat and he goes across the Sea of Galilee and he's going to the other side. And your previous picture showed a good view of that. And the Galilee at its widest part was probably about 7, maybe 8 miles wide. And going to the other side, we read that, John, and we think geographically primarily. That's how our Western minds think. But Hebraically and growing up contextually and culturally, going to the other side was going to a totally different world. It was a pagan side. Religion was different. Geology was different. Geography was different. Politics were different. And so there's a reason those good Jewish boys didn't necessarily want to get out on the boat on the other side. And that's where Jesus saw, and of course, healed the demoniac, probably in the area of Cursey, and then sent the crowd of pigs down the slope, jumping into the Sea of Galilee. It said a large herd, and in fact, one of the Gospels tells us 2,000. When I'm on that boat ride, I'm often thinking, what would it be like to be pulling into shore here and seeing 2,000 carcasses bobbing on the water?
This is perhaps the only area on the east side, Steve, as you know, just south of Kersey, about 3/4 of a mile, where there is actually a cliff. And I
Yep.
think that it may have taken place there. And what a transformational experience here, too. The man, Jesus says, go back and tell your family, your friends what I have done for you. Just a good example of personal evangelism, if you will. He wanted to go with Jesus, but Jesus says, no, go tell someone else what I've done for you. That's a great teaching model, I think, too, of discipleship.
I do too. There's a couple things I would quick highlight there. Number one, so often Jesus would tell people after healings, don't tell, don't tell, don't tell.
Hmm.
That was usually people in his Jewish context where he didn't want people to get ahead of him and cause more conflict. But now he's in this phase 5. We're in the last 15 months. But Samaritan woman, yeah, she runs into town and tells, and Jesus doesn't mind. This guy says, let me come with you. And Jesus goes, nope. He says, you go tell your family, your friends, your neighbors, where you live, work, study, and play, everything I've done for you and the grace that I have shown you. And now he becomes John the Baptist for the Decapolis, these 10 Greek cities that ranged anywhere from 8 to 14, depending on the time frame. Well, Jesus gets back in the boat after his time there, and he heads back to Magdala. Mary Magdalene, Mary from Magdala. And here we've got a great story. I love how the Gospels kind of blend this story. It's 2 females. It's an older woman who has had an issue of blood for 12 years, and it's a 12-year-old girl. So she was born at the moment and the point in time that this woman started having her problems. And Jairus, the father of the daughter, can you imagine, John? He probably just was pacing that seashore, wondering, when's Jesus coming back? Is Jesus coming back? I can't wait for Jesus to get back. And then when he's finally there, Jairus is thinking, maybe I'm going to get some help now. and his miracle is derailed by this unnamed woman.
Mm.
And yet Jesus is able to heal and to take care of both of them. The juxtaposition with what's going on between those two stories is just amazing. Talk a little bit about this, John.
Well, let's just go back to this slide quickly. This is the port of Magdala. So when Jesus sails in, of course, the lake was a little higher back 2,000 years ago, but there's evidence of this being the harbor. And then this first century synagogue is remarkable discovery under only about 14 inches of dirt. And you can see how modest it really is. I know in other sessions I've talked about maybe how many people could sit on these two benches, and then maybe there was a bench on the outer area too. So I think maybe 50 or 60, but we can even picture Jesus here, and maybe Mary Magdalene heard the message, maybe not in the synagogue setting, because we're not sure of whether that was a men or a women thing, whether they were separate. That's a cultural thing, but that's how archaeology can help us picture these locations. And even this picture of one side of Bethsaida, well, we talked about Bethsaida already. There was a blind guy who was healed here by Jesus. This is called Et Tel, but it's about a mile and a quarter away from the lake today. And so some would believe that this was Bethsaida, but maybe it was in the area of Bethsaida where this story took place, a miracle that's mentioned in all four Gospels. Tell us about this miracle.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Right before this, John, as Jesus had gotten back with his disciples and after Magdala, he makes a final visit to Nazareth. It says he can do very little because of their lack of belief. Then he talks about this shortage of workers, and the people are harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. We need more workers in the harvest field. And then he commissions the 12. Now he's already, called and appointed them as the 12, but now he's going to commission to send them out on their own. They've been out with him quite a few times with him, at least 3 different times and longer trips, plus all those fishing trips. But he puts them together. I often wonder, how did he choose who he was going to pair up? Who got to be with Judas? Who got to be with the sons of thunder? Who got to be with Peter, who knew it all and did everything the way he wanted to do it? But he sends them out, and it says Jesus goes out too. So you have 7 teams going all around the Galilee. What a buzz. They come back all excited. The Gospels right here give us a little flashback to the fact that this is John the Baptist has been beheaded. So when Jesus gets back in the Capernaum area, the 6 different teams come drifting back in. He has to tell them about John the Baptist. And remember, that was who a bunch of them followed in the beginning. And so he says, you guys have been so tired, you even haven't had time to eat. Let's get away. And he
Mm.
wants to get out of Galilee. So he goes across the Jordan River right to where that Bethsaida location is. And he does a huge a miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, the only miracle that all 4 Gospels record, other than resurrection and things of Jesus. So it's the only one that way, and some great leadership lessons and multiplication lessons that we don't have time to get into today. And then after that, he is going and bringing the disciples back into Capernaum area. And you can leave that slide up, John. And he talks about, the bread of life in John 6, and a bunch of disciples start to defect and leave. And Jesus turns to his disciples and says, are you going to leave too? After he has that big conversation about the bread of life and eating his flesh. And the disciples, Peter says, absolutely not. Where would we go to? Because you're the one that has the words of life that way. Well, eventually, Jesus starts to head to Caesarea Philippi, and you have that listed on the map. And Caesarea Philippi was the city that Herod Philip, one of the sons of Herod the Great, a brother to Herod Antipas, that he built as a city to honor Caesar. His dad had built Caesarea on the coast, and this was up at the base of Mount Hermon. And John, four big things took place here. First off, Jesus says, "Who do people say I am?" Well, you're one of the prophets, you're a religious leader. He goes, "But who do you say I am?" And Peter goes, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." So Peter's confession of faith, big first thing. Second, this is the first time Jesus mentions the church. On this rock, this church is going to be built, and the gates of hell are not going to prevail against it. So Jesus talks about the church. Third, he gives the first overt prediction of his death, burial, resurrection. And fourth, we have the transfiguration, where he takes the three disciples, the inner three, with him. I believe the location of that was Mount Hermon. They were right at the base of that. And they go and understand this transfiguration. You read the Gospels, and you can tell this is nothing that those gospel writers knew how to describe. They give different definitions of how bright it was and everything. And interestingly, Moses and Elijah appear. And Luke is the one that records the fact that Moses and Elijah speak with Jesus about what is to come. And I think here the Father, in his graciousness and kindness, lets those guys kind of encourage Jesus about the road ahead. Because from this point on, John, we're, I would say, 8 months from the cross about. And from this point on, it says Jesus turned his eyes towards Jerusalem. Now, he didn't go there in a straight, hey, I'm making a hard dash there in 6, 8, 10 days. But now his mind is definitely turning to his passion, because that was one of the things that he shared overtly with them at that point in time. So a key stop that's referenced by the different gospel writers, and four things that happen there.
And the fact that Jesus asked that question, who do you say I am, in the proximity of Caesarea Philippi, where there were many pagan temples here. In fact, the temple of Augustus here, where I'm pointing, doesn't say Jesus went inside, but in this region where all of these temples were. So the relationship, if you will, with the religious flavor of this pagan city versus what Jesus was asking his disciples, I think is quite amazing. And then Mount Hermon, most people don't know that Israel has a snow-capped mountain. Sort of looks like Minnesota, where you're from, Steve, but
Yeah,
a high mountain that's owned by 3 countries today. Syria has the highest peak at 9,200 feet. Israel, the second highest at 7,300 feet. But yeah, indeed, Jesus is transfigured. And can we say that Moses actually did make it to the promised land, huh?
that's always the trick question, right? Did
That's a
Moses
true
make the
question.
promise?
In the
Only at the
summer, I don't know if you've done this, Steve. In the summer, we take the gondola up to the top of Mount Hermon. Great view of even Lebanon further to the west and north, and of course Syria to the other direction. But here we go. We'll finish up as Jesus heads to Perea and then eventually to Jerusalem.
Yep. So what's happening here? September, October of the year before his crucifixion, Feast of Tabernacles, he's back down in Jerusalem, John 7, 8, and 9. And then he commissions the 70 or 72, depending on the translation, and sends them out. And in Luke chapter 10, we get the commissioning of those 70, 72. We get the story of the Good Samaritan, and we get Mary sitting at Jesus' feet, again, showing a disciple. John, I love in that Luke passage, we get the Great Commission with the 72 going out. We get the Great Commandment to love one another. And the only way you're going to fulfill the Great Commission, Great Commandment, is the Great Commitment. And the Great Commitment is that we need to sit at the feet of Jesus and hear what he's having to say to us, and follow closely after him. Shrink the distance between where he's at and where I'm at. He's never moving away from me. It's me that tends to move away from him. Well, then he's back down in Jerusalem at the Feast of Dedication. And that would have been what we now call Hanukkah. That would have been in December, John 10. They attempt to stone him. And now you've got Perea marked. And you've got a few slides on Perea. And Jesus is going through Perea. And I think this is probably January, February. I think he plans on staying in Perea, just doing teaching until it's time for him to make the final ascent up to Jerusalem for Passover. But something breaks in the way here. Lazarus dies.
Mm.
He wasn't planning on that. And Lazarus had been in the grave 4 days by the time he got up to Bethany. John, I think Bethany was one of his favorite places on earth. It's where he found respite and peace with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. There's a great little book that's been written about that, his favorite hometown. And he goes back up there. And when he raises Lazarus, all these people start to believe. And now the religious leaders go nuts. And they say, if this keeps up, the Romans are going to take our land and they're going to take our power, our temple from us. And Caiaphas makes that very prescient statement, it's better that one man die than we lose everything. And we know that's what's going to happen. So they start to plot right then and there, probably February of the year that Jesus is going to die. What I love is there's a little text in the Bible, and it says in John 11:64 that 11:54, that he goes to this little town of Ephraim. And that's not like the tribe of Ephraim. It's a little village. Today it's called Taibe, and it has the distinction of being the only all Christian village in the whole nation of Israel. So it's Arab Christians. There are Catholic churches there. There's Greek Orthodox, some of both. There's a couple other ones. There's ruins of older churches. But they're so proud of the fact that they provided a place of respite, a place of escape for Jesus after that Lazarus encounter. And then the next thing we see, John, is it says he starts to move towards Jerusalem. But he does it, it says, from the border between Samaria and Galilee. Well, you know what that border is, John. There's only one border there. It's the Jezreel Valley. So he probably made his way up from Ephraim when it was time for all the pilgrims. He got in the pilgrim crowds, and now he's down in Perea. And you have that on the map and had noted that on the map. And as he's down here now, he's just walking and talking and he's teaching. He's talking about the cost of discipleship. He's talking about the marks of a disciple. It's final conversations with his own disciples as he's getting ready to go to Jerusalem. They're bickering over who gets to sit on which side of him. And they finally get to Jericho, and they reprovision at Jericho because they've got that 17-mile uphill walk that you talked about earlier. So they're going to make sure they've got water and some food. And there's where he meets blind Bartimaeus and he meets Zacchaeus. And those two stories happen. And at the end of that time, he makes his final ascent up to Jerusalem. And he gets to, after Jericho, and he finally gets up to Jerusalem, probably to Bethany to stay at Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And then we move into Passion Week, that last 8-9 days of Jesus' life before his resurrection. So I see you've got a good picture of Jericho here.
Yeah, the New Testament Jericho, as we call it, Hasmonean or Herodian Jericho, consists of the palace area. The Old Testament Tel is a little further north, but yeah, Bartimaeus, this blind guy who recognizes the messiahship of Jesus, it happened here. So most pilgrims, including Jesus, would have actually turned westward, and there you can see how high and hard and difficult the path must have been from this area of Jericho after the encounter with Bartimaeus, and then through the desert, Jesus goes into the area of the hill country of Judah and Jerusalem specifically. So could you imagine walking up this area? There, of course, is the dirt road that we use today. And yet look how drastic the drop-off is here in what we call the Wadi Kelt, and even uh, some steps cut into the softer limestone that preserves the most likely pathway used by Jesus on his way to Jerusalem. And what a great view, an aerial view of the area of Bethany. and the Temple Mount, where Jesus would spend his Passion Week. And of course, we'll invite you back to talk about the chronology of this particular last week of Jesus, and of course, the city of Jerusalem that Jesus knew quite well. Looking incidentally from the Dead Sea area, from the Jericho area just to the north, and how the pathway, the road between Jericho and Jerusalem took right through the heart of the Judean desert, and then on the backside of the Mount of Olives, it's not pictured here, but the city of Bethany and Bethpage, and then you crest this ridge called the Olivet, and this is what you see from the east. But what a
Yeah.
great image of the Jerusalem that Jesus knew, and we'll spend more time in detail about that in our next session. Steve, any closing comments before we wrap this session up?
Again, I would just say Jesus was so intentional about where he did things, what, who, when. He had those first 30 years just in terms of his own preparation period where he grew in wisdom and favor and stature with God and man. And then he had his ministry foundations where he started calling those first people to follow after him. And after that, he said, it's not just enough to follow, you need to get in the game. If you're going to be part of my multiplication movement, we need more workers in the harvest field. Let's go fishing. And then after that, after intense time, he's had a year and a half to year and 3/4. Now he can pray and say, Father, who would you choose for me to pour my life into? He chooses the 12. There's extended people beyond that. There's women. There's an inner core of 3. And now he equips them for leadership multiplication, knowing his time is coming to an end. And when we talk next, we'll take a look at those Passion Week, the geography, and some of the lessons that are being learned along the way there. Been great to be with you today, John.
Well, thanks for your expertise, your heart, your passion. You are a disciple maker. That your ministry has been really centered around that theme. So thanks so much for sharing a lot of new insights for me, as well as I'm sure our audience. And we really appreciate your time today and look forward to our next session that we will post actually immediately following the posting of this one that you're looking at today. So thanks again for tuning in to this series called The Life of Christ in Context. We hope that you've been blessed. And until next time, Shalom.